After spending 2 years hunting in Alaska, I had successfully bagged 2 sheep, 2 goats, 2 caribou, a moose, and a black bear. Pretty good for someone just starting out. However, the one thing missing from my list was either a grizzly or a brown bear. When I first got assigned to Alaska, I knew that my top priority was hunting a grizzly. I had read in numerous hunting magazines and books about how dangerous and aggressive these animals could be, with warnings stressing the importance of caution while hunting them. They were described as formidable predators, and I was eager to face the challenge. But after 2 years of hunting in various parts of Alaska, I hadn't seen a single grizzly. After talking with several hunters, taxidermists, and biologists, I began to reconsider my original goal. Instead of chasing a 6 to 8 foot grizzly, I found myself more interested in pursuing a large 8 to 10 foot brown bear. It seemed like a far more rewarding challenge, and the idea of taking down such a massive creature felt even more exhilarating. After doing some research, I decided that my last hunt in Alaska would be a brown bear hunt on Kodiak Island. In February 1968, I called the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in Kodiak to speak with a biologist. I learned that the state had recently introduced a new system for hunting brown bears in the area. Hunters now had to request a specific location and time frame for their hunt in order to manage the number of hunters throughout the season. The biologist provided me with a list of available areas, and I applied for the Little River Lake area during the first 10 days of May. A few years later, this system evolved into a first-come, first-served approach, where hunters had to arrive in Kodiak the day before the permits were to be released in order to secure the best spots. Guides would even hire people to stand in line for them. My friend Earl, who had flown to Kodiak twice, managed to secure the Red Lake area both times. Eventually, Alaska switched to a lottery-based permit system, where chances of getting the prime hunting locations on Kodiak are now less than 2%. For this hunt, I decided to team up with my good friend Denny Bush and 2 younger airmen, Gary Binkley and Tex Sodergren. We made arrangements with Kodiak Airways to fly us into Little River Lake. I had checked with the Coast Guard, who had a regular flight service from Elmendorf AFB to Kodiak twice a week, and they told me there was usually plenty of room on the flight so we could fly standby. The free flight sounded like a perfect deal for us. 2 weeks before our scheduled departure, I injured my trigger finger while playing volleyball at the missile shop. A doctor at the base hospital placed it in a metal splint, and I was instructed to wear it for a month. Despite the injury, I took my rifle to the range and practiced shooting with my middle finger. It wasn't ideal, but I decided that it wouldn't be a huge problem. I wasn't about to cancel the trip. It was my last opportunity to hunt a brown bear before leaving Alaska. With my finger immobilized and taped up, I got a lot of curious looks from both Coast Guard personnel and staff at the flying service when we arrived in Kodiak. A couple of people even asked, "Are you really going hunting like that?" I reassured them that it was just a minor inconvenience and wouldn't stop me from going on the hunt. We loaded up the Widgeon, a small amphibious plane that can land both on water and on hard runways. It's a really cool aircraft. As we made our way to Little River Lake, the pilot mentioned that he wasn't sure whether the ice had cleared from the lake yet. As we neared the cut in the mountains, we saw there was still plenty of snow on the north-facing slopes, and the valley floor had patchy snow. After passing through the cut, we saw that the lake was still frozen solid, covered with snow. The pilot circled back and decided to land us near a cannery at Uganik Bay, about 4 miles from the lake. We had packed our gear, so all we needed to do was unload the plane and set up camp. However, we weren't exactly prepared for a 4-mile hike, each of us carrying about 100 pounds of gear on GI pack boards. We opted to leave some gear behind, including the tent and shovel, deciding to use a cabin once we got there. The climb up to the valley was a 700-foot rise through alder trees, raspberry bushes, and other thick vegetation. It wasn't a difficult climb, but certainly not what we had hoped for. After about 200 feet of climbing, we decided to leave some of our gear under a cluster of spruce trees, figuring we could come back for it later if necessary. We still had a Coleman stove, fuel, a lantern, and plenty of sea rations along with some other supplies. Of course, today we have freeze-dried meals and better packs, so it wouldn't be as difficult. But that day, it was tough and took us the entire day. To make matters worse, it started snowing as we hiked. We finally reached the cabin at the lake, an 8x10 plywood structure that belonged to Alf Madsen, an old Alaskan guide. The cabin was designed for 2 people, so fitting 4 of us in there was tight. After storing our gear and unrolling our sleeping bags, Gary, who was sitting on one of the cots, decided to wipe down his Ruger Super Blackhawk 44 Magnum. Suddenly, a deafening noise broke the silence as the pistol went off, and Gary screamed in pain while shaking his hand. The air in the cramped cabin was instantly filled with down and feathers from the hole the bullet made in Gary's sleeping bag. Dennis and I were standing no more than 3 feet in front of Gary, and Tex was sitting 3 feet to our right. The only good thing was that Gary had pointed the pistol to his left, meaning the bullet missed his hand. He only suffered powder burns from the fire shooting between the cylinder and frame. That could have been a deadly mistake. One of us could have been seriously injured or worse. We were fortunate. The ringing in our ears lasted for hours after that. Dennis and I stepped outside the cabin, both of us still in shock. Not exactly the way you want to begin a hunt. For the next 3 days, we hunted the creek drainage below the lake, but all we saw were a few deer. It wasn't the hunt we had hoped for, but we pushed on, hoping that things would improve. There was less snow than expected, so we thought this would be the perfect spot for the bears. At the time, I didn't realize that during spring hunts, it's actually the southern slopes of the mountains that are more promising, not the lower drainage areas. On the 4th day, I caught a glimpse of a bear coming down the mountain and heading into the drainage. It disappeared, and the next thing I knew, it had passed by me. It caught my scent and paused for a brief moment. That was enough time for me to fire off 2 quick shots, but I missed both times. That was the only bear we saw in that area. The following day, we decided to give up on that area and hike back to the cannery. After finishing most of our food, the walk out was much easier than the hike in. I can't recall exactly where we slept, but I believe it was in one of the cannery buildings. We talked to some locals who told us about a native named Daniel Boone Creed, who lived nearby and was known for his expertise in hunting brown bears. We decided to visit his home, where his wife kindly invited us for an evening meal of barbecued beaver and freshly baked warm bread. It was a real treat. Daniel, who was in his early 60s, offered to take us hunting the next day. For a small fee, he agreed to guide us up the coast to a small valley. Gary and I decided to join him. The next morning, we climbed a hill and got a good look at the southern slopes of the mountain. By the afternoon, we spotted one bear, but the wind was wrong and it spooked. We made our way back to the cannery for the night, and the next morning, we were picked up by Kodiak Airways. That hunt didn't result in a successful kill, but it was a valuable learning experience. It was my first of many brown bear hunts, and even though I left Alaska in June without a bear, I knew I'd return for another opportunity. In October 1970, I was back in Alaska, heading to the Alaska Peninsula for another brown bear hunt. This time, I was hunting with my Air Force buddies Russ Ludke, Doug Simmons, and Buddy Hagwood. We had decided to stay at Lee's cabin in Wide Bay, and Peninsula Airways flew us in using their widgeon. As we neared Lee's cabin, the pilot, Orrin Siebert, informed us that the waves were too high to land in the water, so he would have to land us at the airstrip in Wide Bay, which was 5 miles from the cabin. I couldn't believe this was happening again. After unloading the plane, we spoke with an assistant guide and a packer who were camped near the strip, waiting for Ken Oldham to bring in his client. Little did I know that 17 years later, BOAA Alaskan Outfitters would purchase the Wide Bay area from Ken Oldham. We moved our gear to the north end of the strip and decided to hike down the beach to get further away from the guide operation and closer to Lee's cabin. We made it about 1.5 miles before we realized that carrying a 70-pound tent along with all the rest of our gear was too much, so we set up camp in the alder. We hunted the area hard, and on the third day, Russ harvested a stunning 8 feet 10 inches brown bear that was walking down the creek. I made another mistake during this hunt by trying to cover more ground on foot instead of finding a good spotting hill and spending more time glassing the creeks and lower hillsides. Over the course of our 8-day hunt, we only spotted 4 bears because we didn't do enough glassing or target the proper areas. In the spring, you find a good knoll and scan the hillsides, while in the fall, it's best to glass the creeks and lower hillsides. This hunt ended up being another great learning experience, one that would prove valuable when I became a brown bear guide in later years. After Russ had successfully harvested his bear, I was more determined than ever to get a big one myself. After conducting further research, I decided to head further down the peninsula for my next hunt. It was the spring of 1971, and we selected Chignik Lake as our destination. I made arrangements with Peninsula Airways for the flight, and this time, I was hunting with Doug Simmons and another Air Force buddy, Dan King. Upon arriving at King Salmon, we were informed that Chignik Lake was still frozen, but they could drop us off downstream at Chignik Lagoon. From there, we could arrange for a local to boat us up the river. Since we were already in King Salmon, the plan seemed solid. We loaded up the Cherokee 6 and headed out. Chignik Lagoon was a small fishing village with about 25 families. Most of the families had large fishing boats with commercial fishing permits, and the residents of Chignik Lake Village worked for the permit holders in the lagoon. We hired one of the locals to take us up the river in his skiff. The trip was a bit chilly, but it was manageable. Due to the melted ice near the shore, he was able to take us about 1 mile past the lake village to a small, old cabin. The windows were broken, and there was a layer of snow inside. We found an old shovel in the cabin and began clearing the snow. To block the cold, I used a piece of visqueen to cover the windows. However, the cabin was situated about 4 miles from the mountainsides, meaning we had to walk at least 2 miles to get to a good spot to view the southern exposed hillsides. Unfortunately, the weather only allowed us to hunt for 4 of our 7 days. During that time, we spotted a total of 3 bears, including a sow and a boar, that were in the process of mating. We made an attempt to take both of them at once, but ended up missing our chance. We could have taken one of the bears at any point, but ultimately did not secure a shot. On the 5th day, Doug successfully shot a 7-foot 8-inch bear in the snow on the north side of the valley, about 5 miles from the cabin. That was the only bear we managed to harvest. Afterward, I decided this area would be better suited for fall hunting, particularly if we stayed in the cabin. I made a note to return during the fall season. Fast forward to October 1971, when I returned to Alaska, this time with Dick Roberts, Bobby Butler, and John Moulet. We flew in the Peninsula Airways Widgeon to Chinook Lake for the fall brown bear season. The weather was windy, and as we approached, Orrin, the owner and pilot, told me he hoped the waves wouldn't be too large for him to land the plane. I had heard this line from pilots before, but this time I really wanted him to land where we had arranged, since this was the 4th time I had encountered such uncertainty. As we flew over the lake, which was dotted with white-capped waves, the pilot told us he thought he could manage to land. However, as we descended and the waves splashed against the windshield, I began to wonder if this was a mistake. Fortunately, The plane handled the conditions well, and we safely taxied to the beach right in front of the cabin. Upon unloading, we were greeted by silver salmon swimming around us, which gave me a good feeling that this would be the trip where I'd finally get my brown bear. After settling in and stowing our gear in the cabin, we headed out to try our luck at fishing. We had brought along a 4-piece eagle claw rod and a Mitchell 300 reel with some pixies. Fishing was fantastic, and we kept one of the larger catches for dinner. The next morning brought light misty rain, but visibility was still good. Around 10 a.m., we spotted our first bear, and Bob was ready for the shot. With the wind in our favor, he made a clean shot at about 100 yards, bagging a 7-foot 6-inch brown bear. This was everyone's first brown bear hunt, except for me, so the others decided they'd take the first legal bear that presented itself. 2 days later, Dick shot an 8-foot 3-inch bear, and 2 days after that, John took the largest of the bunch, a 8-foot 9-inch boar. It was the biggest bear we had seen on the hunt. My goal was to hold out for a 9-footer. With 3 days left, I remained hopeful. We were spotting 3 to 4 bears each day, but some were sows with cubs, so we didn't take any of those. On the last day of the hunt, the light was starting to fade. John and I were scanning the creek bottom from a 50-foot high grassy knoll. I started packing up my gear and told John to do the same, thinking our day was over. But just as I was about to leave, I spotted him. A bear had just jumped into the stream, chasing after a fish about 500 yards to our left. This bear was larger than any we had seen so far. Without wasting any time, I told John, "Let's go." The wind was perfect as we made our way off the knoll. I had watched this creek for the past 4 days, so I knew exactly how to approach. As we moved down into the alder thicket, the light was rapidly fading, and we had to move fast. When we were about 50 yards from where we last saw the bear, we could hear him splashing around as he continued to chase fish. We both chambered around and crept forward carefully, step by step. Then, there he was, about 35 yards away, slowly moving through the stream. We stopped, and I raised my .300 Winchester to my shoulder, lining up the crosshairs on his shoulder. Boom! The shot hit its mark. We crossed the creek, and as soon as we reached the small bank, we saw him struggling to get back up. Without hesitation, we both fired at the same time. It was over. I had my brown bear. We were both ecstatic, but there was still work to do. We snapped a few quick pictures and then got to work skinning the bear before nightfall. After finishing the skinning, we used our flashlights to guide us back to the cabin. The next morning, before the plane arrived, we measured the bear. It was 9 feet 2 inches long. After 4 hunts, I had finally bagged my brown bear. As a guide later on, I always reminded my clients, "It ain't over until it's over." I've lost count of how many bears we've taken right at dusk. My next goal? To hunt down a 10-footer with my bow.